One really important earth material that we haven't talked about at all so far is soil. Soil is the product of chemical weathering. So let's take a look at how that happens. You might have noticed, and sorry if this is a morbid start to the lecture, but you might have noticed in cemeteries that gravestones tend to have very different looks. And oftentimes, old gravestones of different geologic compositions can look significantly older than others that are the same age. On this slide, there are three photos of three different lithologies that make up gravestones. On the left-hand side is a limestone, in the center is a marble gravestone, and on the right-hand side is sandstone. So one of these is more resistant than the others, and that has a lot to do with the chemical makeup of the rocks and the way those minerals are bonded together, whether or not they're resistant or not at all resistant to chemical weathering. All chemical weathering requires liquid water, which of course is going to come from climate. The higher the rainfall, the higher the humidity, the more chemical weathering there will be. As I just showed you in the previous slide, different minerals chemically weather and dissolve differently. In the photograph on this slide, we have an example of granitic rock. In this rock, quartz is resistant to chemical weathering, but potassium feldspar is not. The potassium feldspar crystals break down and form clay minerals which wash away easily or become lichen food. Why is this so? If you think about igneous rocks and the way and the temperatures at which igneous rock minerals crystallize out, you have the first clue as to why those minerals are going to chemically weather and dissolve differently at the Earth's surface. Chemical weathering can only act on the surface of a rock or mineral, and this is because cracks can let in air and water, but without cracks, air and water don't come in, and those crystal bonds remain completely sealed to the outside environment. Granitic rocks have an interesting weathering result because of the potassium feldspar being more readily weathered out than the other mineral components inside. On the left is a photo from a field trip I took some years ago with some students to Joshua Tree National Park. Anyway, that photograph makes me laugh. But the point is these rocks, these granitic rocks in Joshua Tree National Park are very rounded, and they're rounded because of the chemical weathering that's taken place on the outside of the surface. Spheres are an interesting shape because they have the greatest ratio volume to surface area. So it's a shape that naturally gets weathered down to, or that forms easily in nature. So in the right-hand photograph, you see a close-up of this coarse gravel in the foothills around the rocks in Joshua Tree and everywhere else there are granitic mountains. And this gravel is called grus. This is a very specific blocky shaped gravel that's made up of plagioclase feldspars and quartz crystals that results because the rock literally falls to pieces as the potassium feldspars are removed. So here's another photo where you can see a hand sample of granitic rock broken into smaller pieces and then broken into those grus particles. Unlike beach sand and river sand, which is rounded, this grus has a very distinctly blocky shape as a result of those plagioclase feldspars that are still totally intact. If you're near some granitic rocks, you should take a look and see if you can find some grus. So what's happening at surface? There's a rock and it's made up of a whole bunch of different minerals that all have different chemical compositions. On the surface, water is going to infiltrate where there are cracks or sit on the surface where there are divots and pool. In this particular example, we've got purple mineral Y and gray mineral X that are bonded together chemically to make up this rock. Mineral X, that is gray, is stable at the Earth's surface and stable in water. It does not react with water. Mineral Y, in contrast, is made up of certain elements, one of which can be dissolved easily in water. And just by having one element that will dissolve easily in water, that entire mineral is susceptible to chemical weathering. So over time, water flowing across the broken rock or into fractures along the rock or pooling at its surface will slowly alter mineral Y by removing element C and carrying it away. What results from that is that mineral Y, the purple mineral in this example, becomes altered through chemical weathering. It might become hydrated. It might have ion replacement from the water removing an ion and replacing it with hydrogen, for example. And either way, that unstable mineral is susceptible now to be removed, and the particular element that is being removed is going to be carried off with the water that's flowing through the rock. Over time, the rocks that are below this rock or downstream, if there's water carrying off through surface runoff, over time, the susceptible elements to chemical weathering will be removed and redeposited elsewhere. In the case of porous and permeable material, those chemically altered elements are going to be carried down through capillary action, and the elements that have been mobilized are going to be redeposited at depth below the original material they were weathered from. In some cases, this process can result in transforming mineral resources into mineral reserves by concentrating the element of interest into another rock. This is how bauxite forms. Bauxite is the result of chemical weathering above where the bauxite deposits occur. So, because humidity and rainfall are important with chemical weathering, that means that global climate is intricately linked to this process. And it also means that particular resources that require chemical weathering in order to occur are climate dependent as well. Temperatures are hottest in the tropics, which you know, and these occur between 0 and 25 degrees north and south latitude. And this has to do with the angle of the sun, the angle of the incoming rays at the Earth's surface. This is where there's the greatest solar radiation, so we get the greatest temperatures. And conversely, the temperatures are lowest at the poles, which is where the least solar radiation occurs. In addition to temperature, air pressure and precipitation also varies with latitude. The image on the right-hand side is a global map indicating rainfall. And you can see the darkest color is the greatest rainfall and the lightest color is the least rainfall. So there are patches where there are dry areas. You might be familiar with some of those locations. A big dry area occurs over some of our most famous deserts, the Sahara, the Gobi, and Western Australia. The left-hand image shows the variation in high pressure and low pressure from north to south latitude. There are zones of high and low pressure alternating from the poles to the equator. Low pressure zones are areas where air is rising and precipitation occurs. So those low pressure zones line up exactly with the high rainfall areas in the map adjacent. Not surprisingly, the combination of temperature and rainfall contributes to vegetation, and vegetation also contributes to weathering. Vegetation also plays a role in the hydrologic cycle. Evaporation and transpiration and precipitation are largely connected to vast rainforests. So if you think about the interconnectedness of the biomes, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, and the atmosphere, here in this concept of chemical weathering, you can see very much the importance and the linkages across these systems. Referring again to the locations of high and low pressure systems and accompanying precipitation map, and thinking about what you know about the biosphere and global deserts, I want you guys to take a moment and think about where you would expect the highest levels of chemical weathering. Which parts of the world should those occur in? And what are you going to expect to find in those locations from increased chemical weathering? Hit pause, think about it. Well, the result of chemical weathering of rocks is the formation of soil, so long as we have specific conditions in place. There's an acronym you can use to remember the factors that are necessary for the formation of soil. This is not the acronym you're going to find if you look up the factors of soil formation, but I find this version a little bit easier to remember because the first 4 letters in it spell the word crop, and you need soil in order to grow crops. So it's crop with a T. These are climate, which we've just covered, relief or landscape. You're going to have a hard time forming soil in very steep landscapes. The smooth, undulating, flatter areas are much better for the accumulation of soil. Organic material, the parent material, what is the chemical makeup of the rocks that are being chemically weathered? And of course, we need time. So here we have an interesting graph that connects these factors, with the exception of time, to various families of soil types. On the y-axis, we're looking at moisture variability, and on the x-axis, we're looking at temperature. So across this graph, we've got ranges from cold and dry to wet and cold to warm and moist to dry and warm. Each of the colors indicated on this graph are families of soils. Gelisols are frozen soils like permafrost, so that name is in reference to them being solid. I'm not going to ask you to learn these names. Most of these names have root words that are actually connected to Greek and Latin roots. But it is important to think about that these different soil families exist because of these different conditions that the soil is going to form in, based on temperature and on humidity. You might not be surprised to learn that soils across the entire planet vary tremendously. So here, not only is it a combination of temperature and humidity, but it's also got a lot to do with what the rock that was weathered in the first place is made of. So what is soil? Soil is a combination of mineral matter, organic matter, air, and moisture. You need to have all four of these components in order for it to be considered true soil. Pure, straight organic matter is not a soil. And if it contains no organic matter at all, also not a soil. Soil horizons are stratigraphically layered, just like geologic layers as well. And they do tend to follow the law of original horizontality because of the way that they form. So in a master soil horizon list that you can see hand drawn on the right-hand side here is sort of an idealized section of all the possible layers you might find within a soil column if you were to dig a hole outside and look for the layers of soil underneath the grass. At the top, we have what we call an O horizon, which is a layer of accumulated organic matter. In a forest environment, this is where the leaf litter accumulates every fall as the leaves fall down and die. In grasslands, it comes from plant roots. In every place where there is organic matter, there is organic accumulation. And that organic accumulation occurs from the buildup of dead plant matter and the bioturbation by worms and bugs and other organisms. Below that is an organic mineral layer, layer A. And that organic mineral layer is a mixing of the organic matter that's accumulated at the very top with mineral matter that's built up from the rock below. Beneath that is layer E. E is for illuvial, and the illuvial layer is where leaching takes place. This is where the removal of ions as water passes through on its way down, fed by gravity. So the material that's in E, which is mineral material, that's where it loses matter, loses ions due to water passing through on its way down to the water table. Below that is the very similarly pronounced illuvial, which thankfully is labeled a B horizon and not an I horizon, and I have no idea why. The illuvial with an I, the B horizon, is where those ions are accumulated. Maybe a B is for bauxite, because that's where that would form. B is not for bauxite. Pretend I didn't say that. Below that, we get down into transition areas like BCs, where the material is accumulating and it's also kind of the same as the parent rock that is being broken down and turned into soil, and not really sure where one begins and the other ends. And C is the name for a fractured parent rock that is undergoing weathering. Below that, R is the name for bedrock or the rocky crust below, and that is unaltered original geologic matter. So you're not going to find any soil sequence that looks just like this. So let's look at a couple of examples from different climatic environments. This is an interesting outcrop in Utah. This is a glacially deposited sequence of rock that has since been undergoing chemical weathering in an arid desert environment. You can see on this outcrop of dirt, there are several red lines. These are where I'm marking distinct horizons. Above the top red line, you can see the zone is very dark in color. Below that, you can see that it is a paler color, a distinctly paler color, and there isn't any evidence of roots. In that first layer, you can see bits of roots still dangling down. Below that, we have this sort of finer grained material that's quite white in color. And below that, you can see the next layer is full of big rocks, but it's got a distinct reddish, yellowish tinge to it. Below that, we get into pretty massive gravel zone. And there's an arbitrary line here that I drew between these coarser cobbles below and finer gravels above. We can label these, as a geologist who's not a soil scientist, some of the horizons that I just introduced you to on the previous slide. That upper region where we have the dark root-filled matter, I would call the organic horizon. Below that, the organic mineral labeled A. The white horizon is a distinct color for signs of leaching. When minerals are being leached out, it tends to strip color away. So there's two reasons we can have a very white bleached horizon, and that's one of them. And we'll just leave that as the reason for now. Below that, where we can see the yellowish color, that's an accumulation zone. Here we're accumulating very likely calcium carbonate and iron, and that makes this rusty orange, pale orange color. And below that, we start getting into the parent bedrock material. So here's some examples for idealized soil sections for totally different climatic environments. In forest soils, we usually see a thick zone of organic material. We also see pretty commonly a zone of clay and iron oxide that tends to be distinctly reddish in color. The cartoon is on the left-hand side, and on the lower right, you can see a photograph from forest soil in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. This is forest soil that's formed over formerly glacial sediment. And you can see at the bottom of the soil pit, besides water, which is indicating that it is a very wet environment, you can see that distinctly rusty yellow color that would be that iconic zone of clay and iron oxide accumulation. Now looking at an example of grasslands, the title is covered, but you can see the grass at the top of this cartoon column on the right-hand side. It's grasslands, we get pretty similar set of soil horizons to that of the forest. But you can see here there's a very thick A horizon and a very thin O horizon at the very top. That zone of clay and iron oxide accumulation is still present in grasslands, which are pretty characteristic of these organic rich environments. As a good example of this, you can see in the upper left-hand side, the red soil of Martha's Vineyard. It has a very well-developed organic mineral layer at the very top that is quite gray, and a distinct color transition from that gray OA horizon at the top to the very red horizon that is the B layer below. In arid soils, desert soils, they look quite a bit different. Here we often see an upper horizon that is dominated by wind-blown dust. In the upper right-hand, you can't see probably too much of it, but in the upper right-hand photograph is another example from Utah. And here we have this distinctly white calcium carbonate collection zone. So we can see that in the cartoon, this clearly labeled CaCO3 horizon. These can be quite solid, almost like a ceramic plate in the horizon of the soils. They can require shovels and picks to actually break through if you're trying to dig a soil pit with such a thick calcium carbonate accumulation below. Another interesting example that we can look at in regards to soils is the concept of a paleosol, which might be equivalent to what you would call a fossil soil. So here in this photo, we actually can see fossilized roots. They're fossilized, and that formerly soil at the lower half of the photograph is completely turned to rock now. Just above the fossilized roots, you'll see the black line. That black line is carbonized fossil soil. The soil, which is extremely organic rich in that upper portion where the roots were, when it gets lithified into rock, it's reduced to its elemental carbon, and it's just now a carbon line within the rock. And then above that, and above the iron staining, you can see this white granular looking material, and this is a very pure quartz sandstone. Perhaps you can make out in the sandstone that the lines are sort of angled within it, and this is an exception to the principle of original horizontality. Sand dunes tend to form with this angled layered horizon within its composition, which is extremely distinct. So here we might hypothesize that this was a grassland soil that got covered in a windstorm and eventually completely turned into desert. And the only evidence of that soil that remains is beneath the lithified sand dunes in the form of this thin carbon line and fossilized roots. In a totally different contrast of a soil, I'd like to take you to Fogo Island in Newfoundland on the east coast of Canada. It's right there. We're going to go to a corner of Fogo Island called Tilting and take a look at some interesting soil formation there. This is a landscape that is granitic bedrock, was completely glaciated in under 2 kilometers of ice during the last ice sheet, and is currently in a cold but very humid environment. It's also adjacent to the ocean, which gives it some interesting characteristics in its soil formation. Because of its climate and temperature, it tends to be covered in mossy grasslands with the formation of peat. If you look closely at this other photograph with the hand in it, you might notice that it looks like that soil is filled with shells, and it is. So this soil here is actually formed on what we call a raised beach. So these are beaches that existed as soon as the last ice sheets melted away. But with the reduction of the mass of ice on various glaciated landscapes, the Earth's crust rebounded. By rebounding, it raised up. This is called isostatic rebound, and we'll talk about that at another time. But as a result of that, the original beaches, once the ice sheets melted away, were uplifted and removed from their proximity to the sea. The new beaches were formed on the remaining crust that was lower down. So soil formation and chemical weathering took place on these old shelly beaches. So already the composition of this soil is very interesting indeed. If we have a look at some of the more inland developed soil, you can see some of those characteristic colors from the images of soil profiles I showed you earlier, like the red iron accumulation zone below. But you can also see that there's clearly a mix of black and white in amongst it. This is a soil we would call sandy loam. So the combination of lichen and peat and seashore material, like all of these old shelly matters, that contributes very much to the presence of organic material in the upper portion of the soil. This soil is formed on top of the bedrock granite and gabbro. Granite is rich in potassium, gabbro in magnesium. Both of them contain calcium. But the soil also contains a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. So where might nitrogen and phosphorus come from? Well, this actually has to do with human history. The Irish settlers in Tilting and Fogo Island are active gardeners. They still are today. And when they first came over, they brought with them all of the vegetables that they loved from the UK, and they took advantage of being near the shore. The easiest natural fertilizers available were seaweed and dead fish. So they would cover their gardens in seaweed and dead fish, unknowingly contributing to the composition of the soil. So here in this tundra landscape is extremely rich soil from several hundred years of human history, fertilizing with dead fish and seaweed, and the amazing natural composition from sea shells bringing calcium over granitic and gabbroic bedrock on top of raised beaches.